Florida Civic Literacy Exam Practice Test Answers 2024, Part 1. Question 1. What principle ensures that no branch of government becomes too powerful in the U.S. Constitution? Federalism, separation of powers, popular sovereignty, judicial review. The principle of separation of powers ensures that the legislative, executive, and judicial branches operate independently and have distinct powers, preventing any one branch from becoming too powerful. Question 2. Which document declared that all men are created equal and outlined the philosophical justification for American independence? U.S. Constitution, Articles of Confederation, Declaration of Independence, Bill of Rights. The Declaration of Independence, adopted in 1776, declared that all men are created equal and provided the philosophical justification for the colony's independence from Britain. Question 3. What is the main purpose of the preamble to the U.S. Constitution? To establish the first government of the United States, to outline the reasons for the colony's break from Britain, to introduce the Constitution and state its purposes, to list the rights guaranteed to citizens. The preamble to the U.S. Constitution introduces the document and states its purposes, including forming a more perfect union and securing the blessings of liberty. Question 4. Which philosopher's ideas about natural rights influenced the Declaration of Independence? Thomas Hobbes, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, John Locke, Voltaire. John Locke's ideas about natural rights, including life, liberty, and property, significantly influenced the Declaration of Independence. Question 5. What does the system of federalism in the United States refer to? The separation of powers among three branches of government, the division of powers between the national and state governments, the process of amending the Constitution, the checks and balances system. Federalism in the United States refers to the division of powers between the national government and the state governments. Question 6. Which amendment to the U.S. Constitution provides for the freedom of speech, press, assembly, and religion? First Amendment, Second Amendment, Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment. The First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution protects the freedoms of speech, press, assembly, and religion. Question 7. What is the primary function of the legislative branch of the U.S. government? To interpret laws, to enforce laws, to make laws, to review laws. The primary function of the legislative branch, composed of the House of Representatives and the Senate, is to make laws. Question 8. Which principle is demonstrated by the division of Congress into the House of Representatives and the Senate? Checks and balances, judicial review, bicameralism, popular sovereignty. The division of Congress into the House of Representatives and the Senate is an example of bicameralism, ensuring a more balanced representation. Question 9. Which landmark Supreme Court case established judicial review? Brown v. The Board of Education, Marbury v. Madison, Roe v. Wade, Miranda v. Arizona. Marbury v. Madison established the principle of judicial review, allowing the Supreme Court to declare laws unconstitutional. Question 10. What is the main purpose of the system of checks and balances in the U.S. Constitution? To resolve conflicts between state and federal governments, to ensure economic stability, to prevent any one branch of government from becoming too powerful, to maintain the military. The system of checks and balances is designed to prevent any one branch of government from becoming too powerful by providing each branch with powers to check the others. Question 11. Which amendment abolished slavery in the United States? 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment, 19th Amendment. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery in the United States. Question 12. What is the significance of the Supremacy Clause in the U.S. Constitution? It grants states the power to override federal laws. It establishes the Constitution and federal laws as the supreme law of the land. It allows for the amendment of the Constitution. It provides for the election of the President. The Supremacy Clause establishes the Constitution and federal laws as the supreme law of the land, taking precedence over state laws. Question 13. Which principle is the foundation of the American democratic system, allowing citizens to have a say in their government? Judicial review, federalism, popular sovereignty, separation of powers. Popular sovereignty is the principle that the government's authority comes from the people, allowing citizens to have a say in their government. Question 14. What does the Bill of Rights primarily protect? The powers of the federal government, the rights of individuals, the rights of states, the authority of Congress. The Bill of Rights primarily protects the rights of individuals, including freedoms of speech, religion, and the press. Question 15. Which document served as the first governing framework for the United States before the Constitution? Declaration of Independence, Articles of Confederation, Bill of Rights, Federalist Papers. The Articles of Confederation served as the first governing framework for the United States before the Constitution was adopted. Question 16. What right is protected by the Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution? Freedom of speech, right to bear arms, protection against unreasonable searches and seizures, right to a fair trial. The Second Amendment protects the right to bear arms. Question 17. Which amendment granted women the right to vote in the United States? 15th Amendment, 16th Amendment, 19th Amendment, 21st Amendment. The 19th Amendment, ratified in 1920, granted women the right to vote in the United States. Question 18. What concept is defined as the government's obligation to follow fair procedures and rules? Equal protection, due process, judicial review, federalism. Due process is the government's obligation to follow fair procedures and rules when it takes action against individuals. Question 19. Which principle of democracy is reflected in the phrase, "We the people," from the U.S. Constitution? Federalism, separation of powers, popular sovereignty, judicial review. The phrase "we the people" reflects the principle of popular sovereignty, indicating that the government's power comes from the people. Question 20. What is the primary role of the executive branch of the U.S. government? To interpret laws, to make laws, to enforce laws, to amend laws. The primary role of the executive branch, headed by the President, is to enforce laws. Question 21. Which amendment to the U.S. Constitution guarantees the right to a speedy and public trial? 6th Amendment, 7th Amendment, 8th Amendment, 9th Amendment. The 6th Amendment guarantees the right to a speedy and public trial. Question 22. What did the Great Compromise, reached during the Constitutional Convention, establish? A unicameral legislature with equal representation for all states. A bicameral legislature with representation based on population in one house and equal representation in the other. A system of judicial review. The direct election of the president. The Great Compromise established a bicameral legislature, with the House of Representatives based on population and the Senate providing equal representation for all states. Question 23. What principle is demonstrated by the Supreme Court's power to declare a law unconstitutional? Federalism, separation of powers, judicial review, checks and balances. The power of judicial review allows the Supreme Court to declare laws unconstitutional, demonstrating its role in checking the powers of the other branches. Question 24. What was the primary goal of the Federalist Papers? To argue against the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. To support the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. To propose a Bill of Rights. To advocate for the independence of the American colonies. The Federalist Papers were written to support the ratification of the U.S. Constitution and to explain the principles behind its design. Question 25. Which Supreme Court case established the principle of separate but equal? Brown v. the Board of Education, Plessy v. Ferguson, Miranda v. Arizona, Dred Scott v. Sandford. Plessy v. Ferguson established the principle of separate but equal, which upheld state segregation laws for public facilities until it was overturned by Brown v. the Board of Education. Question 26. Which amendment to the U.S. Constitution lowered the voting age to 18? 24th Amendment, 26th Amendment, 22nd Amendment, 23rd Amendment. The 26th Amendment, ratified in 1971, lowered the voting age to 18. Question 27. What is the primary role of the judicial branch in the U.S. government? To make laws, to enforce laws, to interpret laws, to amend laws. The primary role of the judicial branch is to interpret laws and ensure they are applied fairly. Question 28. What is the primary significance of the Emancipation Proclamation? It granted women the right to vote. It declared the freedom of all slaves in Confederate-held territory. It established the first national bank. It guaranteed equal protection under the law. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued by President Abraham Lincoln in 1863, declared the freedom of all slaves in Confederate-held territory. Question 29. Which principle ensures that government officials are not above the law? Rule of law, federalism, judicial review, separation of powers. The principle of the rule of law ensures that government officials are not above the law and must follow it like all other citizens. Question 30. What type of government is characterized by the rule of a single individual with absolute power? Democracy, oligarchy, autocracy, republic. An autocracy is a government system where a single individual holds absolute power. Question 31. What right does the Fourth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution protect? Freedom of speech, protection against unreasonable searches and seizures, right to bear arms, right to a fair trial. The Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable searches and seizures by the government. Question 32. What is the purpose of the 10th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution? To protect individual rights, to reserve powers not delegated to the federal government to the states or the people, to establish the procedure for amending the Constitution, to limit the power of the President. The 10th Amendment reserves powers not delegated to the federal government to the states or the people. Question 33. What was the primary impact of the Supreme Court's decision in Brown v. the Board of Education? It upheld the principle of separate but equal. It established judicial review. It declared racial segregation in public schools unconstitutional. It expanded the power of the executive branch. The Supreme Court's decision in Brown v. the Board of Education declared racial segregation in public schools unconstitutional, overturning Plessy v. Ferguson. Question 34. What is the primary purpose of the First Amendment's protection of freedom of the press? To allow the government to control the media, to prevent the press from criticizing the government, to ensure an informed citizenry by allowing the press to report freely, to guarantee the right to a fair trial. The First Amendment's protection of freedom of the press ensures an informed citizenry by allowing the press to report freely and hold the government accountable. Question 35. What does the principle of majority rule with minority rights ensure in a democracy? The majority can ignore the rights of the minority. The minority has the same power as the majority. The majority makes decisions, but the rights of the minority are protected. The minority can overrule the majority. The principle of majority rule with minority rights ensures that while the majority makes decisions, the rights of the minority are protected from being violated. Question 36. Which amendment to the U.S. Constitution prohibits excessive bail and cruel and unusual punishment? Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment, Sixth Amendment, Eighth Amendment. The Eighth Amendment prohibits excessive bail and cruel and unusual punishment. Question 37. What is the primary purpose of the 19th Amendment? To abolish slavery, to grant women the right to vote, to lower the voting age to 18, to limit presidential terms. The 19th Amendment, ratified in 1920, granted women the right to vote. Question 38. Which principle is demonstrated by the idea that government power should be divided among different branches? Federalism, separation of powers, popular sovereignty, rule of law. The principle of separation of powers divides government power among different branches to prevent any one branch from becoming too powerful. Question 39. Which document begins with the words "We the People"? Declaration of Independence, Articles of Confederation, U.S. Constitution, Bill of Rights. The U.S. Constitution begins with the words "We the People," signifying that the government's authority comes from the people. Question 40. What does the principle of checks and balances ensure in the U.S. government? That the president has ultimate authority, that the judiciary can make laws, that each branch of government can limit the powers of the other branches, that state governments have more power than the federal government. The principle of checks and balances ensures that each branch of government can limit the powers of the other branches, preventing any one branch from becoming too powerful.